July 22nd, 1298. A field near Falkirk, Scotland. William Wallace, the man who'd humiliated England at Stirling Bridge, the commoner who'd made himself guardian of Scotland, the rebel who dared challenge the greatest king in Christendom, watched 10,000 Scottish warriors form defensive circles on the field before him. Behind those bristling walls of pikes, Wallace believed his army was unbreakable. Across the field, King Edward I of England, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, studied the Scottish formations and smiled. He'd chased Wallace across Scotland for months. He'd burned towns, starved garrisons, and brought the largest English army ever assembled north of the border. And now, finally, Wallace had stopped running. The Guardian of Scotland would make his stand here, on this field, behind circles of Scottish spears. Edward had exactly what he needed to destroy those circles. 2,500 English and Welsh longbowmen, and they were about to teach Scotland a lesson it would never forget. This is the story of Falkirk, England's revenge for Stirling Bridge, the battle where the longbow proved it could massacre infantry from distances they couldn't answer. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a battle where English tactical superiority destroyed Scottish courage, where innovation defeated tradition, and where 2,500 archers killed 10,000 men who couldn't fight back. Because Falkirk wasn't just about one battle. It was about England demonstrating that Scottish independence was a dream, and dreams die when arrows fall like rain. But before we get to those killing fields, before we watch English arrows tear Scottish formations apart, we need to understand why Edward I was so determined to crush Wallace. Because without knowing what happened at Stirling Bridge a year earlier, you can't appreciate why Edward brought such overwhelming force to Falkirk, or why he was willing to let his archers slaughter Scots until their arrows ran out. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as brutal as Falkirk. Don't miss them. Let's go back to September 1297, when William Wallace, a minor Scottish knight, a nobody in the eyes of English nobility, did the unthinkable. At Stirling Bridge, Wallace's forces ambushed an English army crossing a narrow bridge, slaughtering thousands and killing the English commander. It was a catastrophic English defeat, a humiliation that shocked England and electrified Scotland. Wallace became Guardian of Scotland, effectively ruling the country in the name of the imprisoned King John Balliol. But Wallace made a fatal mistake. He raided northern England, burning towns and killing civilians. The English called it barbarity. The Scots called it retaliation for English occupation. Either way, it guaranteed that Edward I would make crushing Scotland his absolute priority. And Edward I was not a king you wanted as your priority target. Edward Longshanks was one of the most formidable kings in English history. He'd crushed Welsh independence in brutal campaigns. He'd reorganized English law and military systems. He was tall, hence Longshanks, ruthless, brilliant, and absolutely determined to bring Scotland under English control. When Wallace humiliated him at Stirling Bridge, Edward swore he'd personally lead an army north and destroy the Scottish rebellion completely. By summer 1298, Edward had assembled a massive force, perhaps 26,000 men, including 2,500 cavalry and, crucially, 2,500 longbowmen from England and Wales. This was the largest English army gathered in decades, and Edward had equipped it with the weapon that would define English warfare for the next century, the longbow. The English longbow was a devastating weapon in trained hands. Made from yew wood, standing 6 feet tall, with a draw weight of over 100 pounds, it could shoot arrows 300 yards and punch through mail armor at close range. More importantly, a trained longbowman could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, 5 to 6 times faster than a crossbowman. The longbow had been used effectively in Wales, but Falkirk would be its first major test against massed infantry in open battle. Wallace, watching Edward's army march into Scotland, faced an impossible strategic situation. He couldn't match English numbers or equipment. His army consisted mostly of common infantry, spearmen armed with 12-foot pikes, brave but poorly armored. He had virtually no cavalry. He had few archers. What he did have was the schiltron formation, circular walls of spearmen with pikes pointing outward like a hedgehog, designed to stop cavalry charges. The schiltron was brilliant defensive tactics against medieval cavalry. Horses won't charge into a wall of spikes. Knights can't break a pike formation if it holds discipline. Wallace had used schiltrons effectively before. At Falkirk, he deployed his army in 4 massive schiltrons spread across the field, each containing perhaps 2,000 men. Between the schiltrons, he positioned his few archers, mostly ineffective compared to English longbowmen. Behind everything, he kept his small cavalry force as reserve. Wallace's plan was simple. Let the English cavalry exhaust themselves attacking unbreakable schiltrons, then counterattack when the English were disorganized. It should have worked. The schiltrons were nearly impossible for cavalry to break. If the English had only cavalry and infantry, Wallace might have won. But Edward had longbowmen, and that changed everything. Think about this for a moment. You're a Scottish spearman standing in a schiltron, shoulder to shoulder with your countrymen, pikes pointing outward. You're ready for cavalry. You've been told you're unbreakable. Then thousands of arrows start falling from the sky. You can't charge the archers. You'd break formation and die to English cavalry. You can't retreat. Wallace's orders are to hold. You can only stand there while arrows kill your friends around you. How long would you hold? Drop your thoughts in the comments. On the morning of July 22nd, 1298, Edward's army approached Falkirk. The English had been advancing through Scotland, burning and plundering, forcing Wallace to give battle or watch his support collapse. Wallace chose to fight, deploying his schiltrons on relatively flat ground near Falkirk. It was as good a position as he'd find, open enough to deploy his formations, but not giving English cavalry too much advantage. The battle began badly for England. Edward's cavalry, eager and undisciplined, charged the Scottish schiltrons before Edward could properly deploy his full army. The knights thundered across the field toward the bristling pike walls. The Scots held formation, pike steady. The cavalry hit the schiltrons and stopped. Horses refused to impale themselves on pikes. Knights couldn't break through. Some English cavalry died trying. Others pulled back frustrated. The schiltrons had worked exactly as Wallace planned. But Wallace's Scottish cavalry, never reliable, mostly nobles more concerned with their own survival than Wallace's commoner army, saw the English cavalry attack and panicked. They fled the battlefield without fighting. In minutes, Wallace lost his entire mounted reserve. Now he had only infantry, locked in defensive formations, with no mobile force to exploit opportunities or protect his flanks. Edward, watching his cavalry's failure, made the decision that would decide the battle. He ordered his longbowmen forward. 2,500 English and Welsh archers advanced to within effective range of the Scottish schiltrons, perhaps 150 to 200 yards, and began shooting. What followed was systematic massacre. The longbowmen could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 2,500 archers meant 25,000 to 30,000 arrows per minute, falling on packed Scottish formations. The Scots, standing shoulder to shoulder in their schiltrons, couldn't dodge. They couldn't charge. Breaking formation meant death to English cavalry waiting nearby. They couldn't effectively shoot back. Their few archers were outranged and outnumbered. They could only stand and die. Arrows fell like rain. Scottish spearmen began dropping by the dozens, then hundreds. Men were hit in the face, throat, arms, legs. The lucky ones died quickly. The wounded screamed and fell, creating gaps in the formation. Other men stepped forward to fill gaps, only to be shot down themselves. The schiltrons, so effective against cavalry, became death traps against archery. Packed formations of unarmored or lightly armored infantry, standing stationary, were perfect targets for massed longbow fire. For perhaps an hour, the longbowmen systematically destroyed the Scottish army. Some schiltrons began to waver as casualties mounted. Men at the back of the formations, not yet under direct fire, could see the carnage at the front. Some began to slip away. Others held, either through courage, discipline, or simply because they had nowhere to run. English cavalry surrounded the field, ready to cut down anyone who broke formation. Contemporary chronicles describe the slaughter in horrific detail. The Bishop of Durham, who fought at Falkirk, wrote that Scottish dead lay so thick they covered the ground. Another account describes arrows falling like snow in winter. Modern historians estimate that English archers shot between 150,000 and 300,000 arrows during the battle. Even accounting for exaggeration, the volume of fire was unprecedented and devastating. Wallace, watching from his command position, saw his army being methodically destroyed and could do nothing. Charging would break the schiltrons and invite cavalry slaughter. Standing still meant arrow massacre. There was no good option. His tactical defensive strength, the unbreakable schiltron, had become his death trap. The formation that stopped cavalry couldn't protect against arrows falling from above. Eventually, the schiltrons began to collapse. Casualties, fear, and the realization that standing still meant death broke Scottish discipline. Men began fleeing toward the woods behind their position. The moment formations broke, English cavalry charged. Now the knights could do what they'd been waiting for: ride down fleeing infantry. The slaughter intensified. Scottish soldiers running across open ground were cut down by cavalry. Those who reached the woods were hunted through the trees. Some tried to surrender. Most were killed anyway. This was revenge for Stirling Bridge, and Edward wasn't interested in mercy. The casualties tell the story of what happened at Falkirk. Scottish losses were catastrophic. Estimates ranged from 10,000 to 15,000 dead, virtually the entire army. Some historians consider these numbers exaggerated, suggesting perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 killed. But even conservative estimates show devastating Scottish casualties. English losses were minimal, perhaps 200 dead, mostly cavalry killed in the initial unsuccessful charges against the schiltrons. The disparity is staggering. For every Englishman who died, 30 to 50 Scots were killed. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter enabled by technological and tactical superiority. The longbow, in trained hands, deployed in mass formations, had proven it could massacre infantry who had no answer to its range and rate of fire. William Wallace escaped the battlefield with a handful of followers. His army was destroyed. His reputation as Scotland's military leader was shattered. Within weeks, he resigned as Guardian of Scotland. He would spend the next 7 years as a fugitive, hunted by Edward's forces, unable to raise another army. In 1305, he was captured, taken to London, tried for treason, and executed with deliberate brutality, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head was displayed on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Scottish cities as warnings. From an English perspective, Falkirk was vindication. The humiliation of Stirling Bridge was avenged. Scottish military power was broken. The longbow had proven its worth as a decisive weapon. Edward could claim he'd crushed the Scottish rebellion and killed its army. English tactical innovation, massed longbow fire coordinated with cavalry, had overcome Scottish defensive formations. But Falkirk didn't end Scottish resistance, as Edward had hoped. Robert the Bruce would take up the cause, learning from Wallace's mistakes. Bruce would avoid open battle until 1314, when at Bannockburn he'd used terrain and tactics to defeat another English army. But that's a story for another video. One we'll be covering soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The battle demonstrated something profound about medieval warfare that would define the next century of English military success. Heavy cavalry, the dominant force for centuries, could be neutralized by well-deployed infantry. But infantry, no matter how disciplined, couldn't survive massed archery if forced to stand still. The combination of longbow and cavalry, properly coordinated, was nearly unstoppable against medieval armies that lacked both. Falkirk established a pattern that would repeat at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. English armies, often outnumbered, would use defensive positions and massed longbow fire to destroy French or Scottish forces. The tactics pioneered at Falkirk would dominate European battlefields for over a century, making England the most feared military power in Western Europe, despite being smaller and less populous than France. The battle also showed the importance of combined arms, different types of troops working together. Edward's cavalry couldn't break the schiltrons alone. His infantry couldn't have defeated Scottish spears in close combat. But his archers could slaughter the Scots from range, and his cavalry could prevent escape. Each arm covered the other's weaknesses. This combined arms approach would become standard English doctrine. From a Scottish perspective, Falkirk was national trauma. The army that had triumphed at Stirling Bridge was annihilated. The Guardian who'd promised independence was forced to flee. Thousands of Scottish soldiers died in a single afternoon. Their defensive formations turned into killing grounds. The dream of easy independence died at Falkirk. Scotland would eventually gain freedom, but it would take decades more of grinding warfare and sacrifices Falkirk should have taught them to avoid. The battlefield itself is now peaceful Scottish countryside. There's a small cairn memorial erected in 1927, marking the approximate site. The land has been farmed for centuries. Nothing visible remains of the slaughter. But walk that ground and imagine 10,000 men standing in tight circles while arrows fell like rain. Imagine the screams, the chaos, the realization that your unbreakable formation had become your tomb. Falkirk deserves to be remembered alongside Crecy and Agincourt as one of England's defining medieval victories. It was the first major battle where the English longbow proved decisively superior to continental tactics. It established Edward I as one of England's greatest warrior kings. It avenged Stirling Bridge and crushed Wallace's rebellion. And it demonstrated that English archers, properly deployed, could massacre armies twice their size. Yet Falkirk is largely forgotten compared to those later battles, perhaps because it was against Scotland rather than France, perhaps because Wallace's later execution overshadowed his military defeat, perhaps because Bannockburn, Scotland's revenge 16 years later, gets more attention. But Falkirk mattered enormously. It was the blueprint for English military dominance, the vindication of the longbow, and the day when 2,500 archers taught 10,000 Scots that courage isn't enough when arrows fall from beyond your reach. Within 16 years of Falkirk, Edward I would be dead, and his weaker son, Edward II, would lose Bannockburn to Robert the Bruce. English dominance over Scotland would prove temporary, but English tactical lessons from Falkirk would endure. The longbow's supremacy, proven here, would terrify European armies for generations, and the memory of what happened when Scottish infantry stood still against English arrows would haunt Scottish military planning for decades. That's what makes Falkirk matter. Not just the one-sided slaughter, not just Wallace's defeat, but what it represented, the birth of English military doctrine that would dominate the 100 Years' War. The longbow's finest hour began here, on a Scottish field, where English archers proved they could kill from distances their enemies couldn't answer. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the tactical innovations, the one-sided victories, the battles where English military genius crushed larger armies, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.